Before we start the show, here's a trigger warning. We will be talking about suicide. Nearly 7 people die by suicide every day in Australia. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death for males. It's estimated that for every suicide completed, another 30 people attempt, which means that approximately 1 Australian attempts suicide every 10 minutes. If you or someone you know is thinking about suicide, please ring 000 now or call Lifeline on 13 11 14. Today we'll be talking to a guest who has lost a loved one to suicide, another person who has made multiple suicide attempts, and finally a researcher who is passionate about suicide prevention. Hi, I'm Sally Ann and I'm a clinical psychologist, wife and mother of 4. Australia has so many interesting and inspirational people who have wonderful stories to tell, but may not have had the opportunity before to share their experiences on Australian television. Our first guest today is Adam Gould. While working for a telecommunications company in the 90s, he was abusing cannabis, leading to hospitalisation, with multiple suicide attempts, often brought on by anxiety. He had some very negative experiences with mental health professionals, but also met a couple of really understanding doctors and psychologists who were able to help. Before we start, here is some footage that Adam contributed for SANE Australia.
The way I found to socialise with people when I moved to Melbourne was to smoke weed. At that stage, I didn't necessarily understand where I was at emotionally. I thought everyone felt like this all the time. Coming from a background of high achievement, both academically and sportingly, I couldn't imagine how I'd gotten there, and I certainly couldn't imagine how I could get out by action.
Thanks for joining us on the Sally Ann Show, Adam. Now, tell us a little bit about the 90s for you. What happened?
Well, Sally, I moved from rural Victoria to Bayswater and I had no social connections whatsoever, and I was fairly isolated. I wasn't involved with any sports or anything, and I found that the way to make friends way back in the 90s was to get into drugs.
Right, so you ended up meeting up with groups of people.
Yep,
and
so I found that there was almost the secret stoner handshake. So you sort of were involved with a group of marijuana users, and it became, for me, not just a recreational activity, but a lifestyle choice. And that addiction is something that, you know, I can't get past it. It's something that I deal with to this very day.
Yeah.
The other part that really shook me up though was the isolation. I isolated myself, and because of the drug use, I cut myself off from my parents and family to a large extent. That led to me sort of using a lot more cannabis.
Yeah.
Towards the end of the Bayswater experience, I was smoking 1/4 ounce a day, which is
Wow.
an enormous amount.
Wow.
I was of the view at that stage that cannabis didn't affect your health in any way except for respiratory-wise.
I think that was a belief in the 90s for many people.
Yeah, and I mean, quite frankly, I sort of discovered that smoking anything isn't necessarily good for you.
No, exactly. So you were right in there smoking with a group of people, I guess, or were you smoking by yourself?
Look, initially I started smoking with people, but because these people weren't the sort of people I associated with previously, because I'd never touched a cigarette up until then, never touched booze or anything, I wasn't comfortable with that social group because they were a little bit rougher around the edges. So I isolated myself further, and it was just a case of the only time I'd socially connect with people was to score.
Yeah.
And then I'd sit at home, this was back in the days of the Nintendo 64, and play video games and smoke weed.
Yeah. So that was your reality there for a while, living here in the city. And then, so you had, I understand that you were suffering from anxiety. You had anxiety issues?
Enormously. I've suffered anxiety all my life.
Yep.
As far back as I can remember, I mean, I'd get anxious about getting something wrong on my homework.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's going back into the suicidal ideation. That started in my before I was probably 10.
Wow.
I mean, my first experience that I directly recall was we had a can collection drive with the Scouts group that I was involved with, and I hadn't collected that many cans, and I got created suicidal ideation from that basis.
Yeah. I've actually had children in my office too that have had also suicidal ideation, and I think that some parents haven't really understood that that's a real possibility. It's not just adults or adolescents, it is actually children as well. So thank you. I didn't know that about you. Thank you for sharing that. Did your parents know at the time? Did they know
Absolutely
that you had?
not. Look, my only experience of suicide at that stage had been being told, look, it's a selfish act, and the other one, it was from the television show MASH. I recall the Colonel Potter was trying to choke a kid to encourage him to fight for his life, and the kid fought for his life and said, now you don't want to commit suicide.
Okay.
And that is a really perverse and extreme view of it.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that setting. So you said that you had, these suicidal ideations, you were using cannabis at that point in time. You had so you made some attempts, I believe, at suicide.
Yeah, look, my early attempts, people could call them a desperate cry for help, and they were to an extent because I couldn't articulate myself.
Yeah.
Look, to be honest, back in those days, you'd be lucky to get hello out of me.
Okay, yeah.
My how things have changed.
Yes, yes, exactly. You're a great talker, actually. So from that point in time, you then started getting some professional help. You said that you sought some...
The company I was working for, because I completely collapsed at work, delusions of grandeur, which I was expressing openly in the office environment, the company was very concerned. We had a wonderful gentleman in HR, though. He came over from Seattle, and he had experience as a psychologist. And he saw what was going on, and he put in place measures to sort of monitor what was happening to me and how I was feeling. And they actually kept me on the payroll without me working for 18 months on full pay.
Wow.
So it's an incredible company. However, in that time I moved from Bayswater back to rural Victoria. Now, back then for me, I was taught to feel ashamed of those feelings.
Okay.
And that shame caused me to bottle them up further and not express them. And then for me, suicidal ideation became an act of benevolence for everyone else. So there was nothing selfish about it. I thought I was doing the right thing for the world in general. Yeah,
because that's one of the things I know that you're quite passionate about doing now, is to reduce the myths for, what people believe about suicide. So, and what you're saying is that there is you had this feeling of benevolence, that it was actually helpful for people to, for you to end up dying by suicide. But obviously you ended up getting some help. So what happened there?
Look, I was very, very lucky in rural Victoria. The community mental health system is, look, there's a lot of stigma involved, but we had a caseworker come over from Holland, I believe it was, and she had a humanist understanding of suicide and looked at it from a holistic point of view. So she said, look, it's not just one thing. It's the way you feel about life and the world. Yeah. And those feelings are legitimate. So how do we change those feelings? What can we do to improve the world you live in?
It sounds like it was a really long process, and I'm glad that you're here to talk to us today. So thank you very much, Adam, for sharing your story with us. After the break, we'll be speaking to a man whose daughter died by suicide 10 years ago.
She felt responsible for her mother's death.
In December 2005, John Bradley's 26-year-old daughter, Heather, died by suicide. Since then, John has become involved with the Compassionate Friends Victoria, which includes facilitating a suicide support group for bereaved parents and siblings. So thanks for being here, John.
Welcome.
First of all, tell us a little bit about Heather. Tell us who she was.
Oh, well, she was the life of the party, a little girl. She was the one that was the daredevil, and would be edged on by her siblings to sort of do the things that they wouldn't do, that she would be game enough to do and think that she might get into trouble for.
It's a very spirited girl.
Very spirited girl, very
and...
feisty girl, yeah, very spirited and a joy to be with. She was lovely and very bubbly, happy person. Okay, always after a joke, like to have a joke and like to have a laugh. Yeah, and she was strikingly beautiful too, Sally Ann, like you. She had very curly hair, long, curly red hair, so she was quite striking and stood out in the crowd.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing the photos with us, actually, because I did see her beautiful hair.
Yes,
it looked
yeah,
great.
It was. It's really stunning.
Yeah. So when you found out that she'd died by suicide, how did you react? How did your family react?
Well, it wasn't so much a shock to me because she had previously attempted suicide on a few occasions. She had a lot of difficulty with her mother's death. Her mother had died some 9 years prior to that, and Heather blamed herself for her mother's death. And despite all attempts for us to reassure her that that wasn't the case, she felt responsible for her mother's death, and so therefore solace and self-medication and alcoholism.
So to feel that as a teenager, then she must have been a teenager. That must have been such a big burden.
She was just 17 when her mother died. Yes, and it was a big burden for her. And so she went down her own road of self-destruction, self-medication, and addiction issues. So that culminated then in her attempt. Actually, when she attempted suicide, it resulted in her being on life support system for the most agonising, disturbing, longest 6 days of my life was in hospital, hoping that the medical people were wrong, that maybe that she will be able to pull through when they switch the machine off.
I'm really sorry to hear that. It must have been such a difficult time. And what was the reaction of family members? And friends?
That varied. You know, people just don't understand unless they've had that lived experience themselves, Sally-Ann. People just don't understand. They didn't react in a way necessarily that I thought they would have reacted. People didn't react. They don't want to talk about death and dying in particular, and they certainly don't want to talk about suicide. So fortunately for me, I was put in touch with the compassionate friends, and that turned out to be such a life changer for me, being in touch with that organisation and the help and assistance it's been to me in that time.
So what do you do with that group? Because I understand that you do some work with them.
I'm a facilitator now. I just actually, my term, I just retired from that role, but I was a group facilitator for a number of years. But that very first night, if I can recall, Sally-Ann, which was just 2 months after Heather died, I went to this support group, not knowing what to expect, and it was a room full of people who had all lost a child through suicide. And it was just such a feeling of relief left me that night. These people understood what I was going through. These people knew how I felt, because other people didn't seem to know how I felt. All sorts of things that people would try and say to you, you know, they would say things, and if somebody starts off a sentence by saying, well, at least, you know it's not going to be good what comes after that. At least you know, she was all right or whatever like that, you know, and see, you know, at least she's happy now or things like that. You know, I believe in, like Adam said before, that it'd be doing other people a favour. I felt Heather was doing me a favour. She hid from me the excesses of her behaviour, and so I think she was doing a favour because Heather was an actress, and you know, so she could cover up a lot of the things. I didn't realise just how bad a lot of things were with her, because she would cover up like that and cover things up. So she was pretty good at that acting part. But I feel that she sort of was doing us a favour. That's what she felt like.
And one of the things that you just said a little bit earlier was that you didn't have a place to talk about it. People don't, and you're right, that's my experience as well. I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I know I do talk about it, but a lot of people just say, I had no one to talk to about it. So whether you're the people left behind or the person that is feeling suicidal ideation.
Well, that was the part that was really, for me, was just this relief. These people knew what I was going through. I could talk to them. They mentioned the child's name. People don't even mention Heather's name. They don't talk about her. You know, they don't say anything unless I introduce the subject. You know, and it was, you know, just recently there was a lady that I was an acquaintance that came to me and said she saw Heather on the rerun of Blue Heelers on television, and she was so happy to tell me it had such a wonderful effect on me, because otherwise people say nothing. And as if to say, I don't want to say it in case I upset you, John. And, you know,
when in fact she was a part of your life, and you want to talk about her.
You know, death ends a life. It doesn't end a relationship.
Absolutely. Look, thank you so much for sharing your story with us, John. I really appreciate it. After the break, we'll be talking to a social researcher who will share her findings on suicide prevention with us. Stay tuned.
there hasn't been a lot of research looking at the first-person experience of suicide in Australia.
Sarah Coker has worked as the Suicide Prevention Project Manager at SANE Australia since 2008. Sarah's background is in social science and she has worked in the mental health sector for 15 years. Her passions include suicide prevention, complex bereavement, and improving the lives of people with mental illness. Sarah is an experienced mental health telephone advisor, workforce trainer, and qualitative social researcher. So tell us a little bit about your research, Sarah.
Sure. Well, SANE Australia partnered with the University of New England to interview people who'd attempted suicide. We were interested in their experiences around that time, what helped them or what hindered them. And the reason that we did this research is because there hasn't been a lot of research looking at the first-person experience of suicide in Australia. There's been a lot more of that kind of research happening in other countries, but we wanted to see what the Australian experience was around attempting suicide.
And what were the main findings? What did you find?
Yeah, well, what we found was that obviously it's a very complex set of issues that will lead somebody to consider suicide. Often there might be overwhelming stresses, previous life experiences, negative experiences, perhaps poor mental health, and all these things can lead somebody to that place where they consider suicide. We found that not being able to access good professional support or get treatment for any kinds of illnesses they're experiencing was a really big hindrance for them to get through their feelings of suicide. And conversely, once they did get good professional support, it made a huge difference for them.
One of my little beefs here, since we're talking about it, is that psychologists only given 10 sessions per year to deal with clients, and when you have a client who's potentially suicidal, you only have a limited amount of sessions to talk to them, and building rapport, I'm sure, that Adam actually mentioned earlier as well, is something that's really important. So,
sure.
But just to help us along here a little bit, what are do you know some of the warning signs that you can share with us for suicide? What would be some of those?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess one of the biggest warning signs and the most obvious is if somebody talks about suicide, even if it's in a joking way or in a way that might not say the word suicide, but they're saying, oh, I don't want to be here anymore, I can't cope with life anymore. I think that needs to set warning bells off, and certainly one of the main findings from the research was that people sometimes felt that they weren't taken seriously and that their kind of cries for help weren't heard, or people thought that they were attention seeking. So
I hear that a lot actually in my practice, that people say, oh no, they're just attention seeking. But as you said, and I'm glad that you said it, is that we actually have to listen and take notice when people say that.
Yeah, so there's that obvious warning sign, but sometimes people don't talk about suicide and they keep it very much to themselves. Like John's speaking about Heather, and in that case, sometimes you might see other signs and things like feeling very hopeless and helpless, withdrawn, isolated, perhaps even starting to settle their affairs or give possessions away. Those can be warning signs to look out for. But obviously the most concerning thing would be is if someone did mention suicide and they also had a plan for how they would carry that out and they had means to access that plan. And that's when, if anyone's concerned about someone in that situation, they really need to get them to help straight away, emergency services or a hospital.
Absolutely. And again, at the end of the show, we will be mentioning some phone numbers that are really important for us to know. So what would be some advice that you might give to help keep our loved ones safe? What might we be able to do to help?
Sure. Look, I think the key to that is communication as much as possible, to have to not be judgmental, to have a conversation that really taps into how that person is feeling and how they're going. Also being aware that for family and friends, the person might find that it's quite difficult to open up to family and friends, and so their role actually might be trying to get them some professional support instead.
And I think really having the conversation as well too, not making people really afraid to talk about how they're feeling, and even if it is suicidal, not to brush it away and say, oh, don't be ridiculous, because I've heard that too. Every week in my office, I meet people that are suicidal and or have suicidal ideation at least. And the thing that they really say, a lot of them would say, is that they just want to be able to tell someone or to say it, to get it off their chest. So, you know, don't be afraid if someone does raise the issue with you to have the conversation with them.
Yeah, and I think it's important to give messages of hope. People can get through it, people can recover, and that was one of the reasons that we produced the video Lessons for Life, so that we could share some positive stories about how people had got through feeling suicidal.
Great. Look, to finish this segment, we're going to show a little bit more of the SANE Australia footage called Lessons for Life.
I've looked at things and said, well, how can I turn this lead into gold, a process of alchemy? How can I make things better? For me, it's writing, it's visual art, it's the stencil art, it's the street art, it's talking with other people, it's the public speaking. It's the way of sort of reaching out to people and saying, I had this experience, but it gets better.
When you're in the deepest distress, there's like just this pinprick of light. And it seems so far away and so distant and so unattainable. But as you get the help that you need and you deserve, that light gets brighter. That's not to say that I'll never feel really depressed again or suicidal again or have those suicidal thoughts. I probably will, and I have. But what's the difference now is I've got the tools that I can use before I get to that place.
I walk around with a great deal of pride these days. Not so much arrogance, but pride. I've come a long way from where I've been.
Thanks to all of today's guests, and thanks to you for watching this important show. I hope today's show has informed you of the impacts of suicide in society. We need to start talking about suicide and educate ourselves about what to do and what not to do. Understand more about the warning signs, and hopefully prevent further suicides in the future. The message from today that we've heard clearly is that we need to talk about it rather than pretending that it doesn't happen. Thanks again for watching the Sally Ann Show. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and we want your feedback, so contact us on our Facebook page and Instagram, or follow me on Twitter.